So welcome and good morning. I really want to thank you for being here. NMC is an incredible conference. As Andy said, it was in Madison about 5 years ago, a terrific event, a really fierce community that actually understands media and manages somehow to always be in the lead and not following. I'm also really grateful to be here in Rochester. I have been terrific friends with people here at the RIT program for a good decade, and this is the first time I get to see their city. I don't know if you're aware, but the games programs that are happening at RIT are absolutely in the lead of what is happening not just nationally but internationally. You know, several weeks ago we were at a congressional caucus, and right now the partnerships that are happening between the Magic Center, RIT at large, and the regional economic stakeholders is held up as a model for how state policymakers can actually partner with universities to be economic engines for regional economic development. And that's a really big deal. I come from a university that, it may be, as Andy said, really well known for sort of being a leader in research, a solid research standard university, right? When you think about like a tier 1 research entity, UW-Madison is one of those. But I got to tell you, we don't do so well at things like innovation or creating contributions to knowledge that are not paper. Right? It's so interesting to me because, and Andy, I gotta say, and Liz, I'm looking at you too, because now that I'm building a game design program on our campus, the amount of resistance to anything that is not paper in academics is amazing, right? Like, I finally got full tenure, so I don't have to worry about this. But, you know, it is incredible to me that, that we can build a game that I can show will, for example, we did one with pre-post fMRI scans that can show that we can actually improve a child's ability to regulate their own attention significantly and in enduring ways. And we can put that product out for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to download it and play it. And yet leadership on campus still looks at me and is like, but what papers did you have that were cited? And we're like, well, okay, so we have those papers we can show you, but the citation rates are like 40 people, And I think that's actually a great index number. Wow, 40 people. Meanwhile, the RIT Center is not just producing paperwork, but actually producing innovations in media that change people's lives. And that is very hard to do in a higher education setting. And it's part of the reason why higher education is under a lot of pressure now to change. But figuring out how to make that change easily is not simple. And frankly, the leadership you have in place that actually might embrace that is rare and ought to be commended and ought to be emulated. So if I can just get your leadership to talk to our leadership to explain how it is that media has shifted. We are not merely in this paper-obsessed world. And now for that topic, while we're on the topic of not a paper-obsessed world, I'm going to talk about media and paper. So games and learning, how many of you are very familiar with games, play games, etc.? Good, I get to breeze through this early part. I love the fact that I used to have to do this long preamble to explain how I wasn't a bad person because I gamed, and how I wasn't a bad person because I wanted to study their intellectual contribution, to which most people go, they're what? Right? That has shifted over time. In the last decade, that has substantially changed. The American public conversation, the policymaker conversation around games is fundamentally different, and that's very exciting to me. I hope we get even further, but I'm excited. But just as a little preliminary, for those of you who don't know, so let's talk about games. We think about first-person shooters and sports games and Angry Birds, which we have all played way too much Angry Birds. But in fact, it's way more diverse, right? We have games like Minecraft. I guarantee you, if you have children in your home, you're probably playing Minecraft. Games like Plague Inc., where you play, basically, you're trying to create a pandemic across the world. Who knew this could be so fun? One of my favorites that's probably a decade old now is Spint.org. This is a game, simple. What I love about this game is that it's cheap, it's browser-based, and it's basically the challenge of you try to be poor for a month and make it, right? It turns out being poor is hard. And for people who don't experience poverty, you have no idea of the choices you have to make when you have to make choices for things like, do I live close and not have to have a car, but it's expensive rent? Or do I live further out where rent is cheaper, but now I'm dependent on a car to drive in, which means it could break. I have to pay gas, etc. I still haven't figured this one out, which may say something about my financial planning, but may also say something about the nature of poverty. Current one that's popular, Undertale. Any Undertale players in here? Liz, I know you're playing it. This is amazing. It's a game where it's an indie game, and it's super fashionable, popular right now. So if you want to be hip in the games industry, play Undertale. It's well worth it. You get to talk your way out of battles. And it turns out if you make it through the game and all you've done is fight, when you replay it, it starts to taunt you. And the history of those battles that you created stick around. Sounds like the rest of my life, right? Where you're like, oh, right. If I go in with swords, hacking, slashing, and backstabbing, it turns out that there are repercussions. Who knew that a popular indie game among the hardcore gamers would be exactly about that dynamic? And games like that Dragon Cancer, made by a couple, that is a game about their experience raising a child with terminal cancer, right? So serious topics are part of games too. The industry is booming. As you just saw, probably 70% of you identify as having games on your devices now, playing them. You could play them while I'm talking. That would be okay with me. But in case you don't know, this is consumer spending for both hardware, software, $25.1 billion. This last year it was $21 billion. This is 2010, right in the middle of the Great Recession. This is larger than both music and movie box office movies, so video games are the new entertainment medium in terms of profit. It's also one of the fastest growing industries in the U.S. economy. This is why I was asked to work in the White House on policy, because the creative tech sector is doing very, very well, and the jobs that are in that sector are important, and I'll talk about that in a little bit toward the end. But it's also growing rapidly. So 2005 to 2010, for example, right during our hard period, the entire U.S. GDP grew by 16%. Games industry revenue more than doubled. And it has barely slowed. It is still continuing to move at this rate. So the games industry, it's not just that people are spending a terrific amount of money on them, but it's actually that they are creating an incredible industry of jobs. They're also spending a terrific amount of time on media games as well. Some of these numbers you probably know. 11 hours of screen time for youth, crammed into 7.5 hours. 11 hours of media consumption crammed into 7.5 hours of screen time. I have a 6- and an 8-year-old in my house, right? I spend a lot of time right now. Some of my current work is on parenting and screens because the American public is very worked up about screens, right? And you see these numbers and you can see why. 11 hours of media consumption and 7.5 hours of screen time, that's more time than they're typically getting in classrooms, right? And games are part of that. They're not the biggest swath, but they are increasing. The data I've seen shows that games are cutting into TV time, but it's about, I think this number is about almost an hour and 15 minutes on average. So games are taking up a huge swath of our entertainment media time and increasingly our educational time as well, which I think is exciting. Games are at heart they're interactive media, right? If it has a role, a goal, and it's interactive, it's a game. So the idea that we're creating media that you don't just sit and watch, that you actually participate in, to me is a really great thing. But I tend to focus more on this learning side. That's my body of research. And I want to tell a story about, I want to use some of the work that I've done to tell a story about games and literacy and paper and their weird relationship in the same ecosystem, and to talk more generally about what is the role of games, not just in a classroom or in an after-school program, but also in higher education and perhaps more broadly. What do they represent? But first, let me talk about what are some of the affordances of games generally. We probably know a lot of them, but why, for example, would policymakers be interested in games? Why would Tom Khalil, Deputy Director of OSTP in the White House, need someone who does games on their staff? That's weird, right? And here's why. So first, in the American population, you have just the sheer coverage. 97% of kids play, both boys and girls. 99% of boys play, 94% of girls play games. In case you were wondering, apparently Gamergators were wondering at some point. It turns out girls game. They like different kinds of games, but they game. Games are models and simulations at root. When I talk to scientists, I can bust out games that are very clearly simulations of real-world systems, like the Plague Inc. game I showed a screenshot of before, games like Civ. But all games are models and simulations of something, even if it's a fantasy world. And for scientists in particular, and economists in particular, this is really exciting. Because science today is really, it's not about this 8-step science sort of pathway. It's about building a model and then testing that model against reality to see whether or not it's predictive. That's what we do. Science is model-based, right? So when you show games to scientists, what they see are models that could be of real-world systems that would actually have goals in them that kids could play, that adults could play, to understand complicated things like how resources are distributed across the globe and why that leads to areas of conflict. Not because people are a certain color or a certain country or a certain nationality, but because resources are distributed in particular ways that lead toward conflict, right? 3, they're architectures for engagement, and I'll have a lot more to say about this. This is Mass Effect 3, one of the prettiest games I've ever played. Ooh, any Mass Effect 3? Oh. We can talk about that later. But games are built to be learned. No one talks about addiction to books, but they talk about addiction to games, right? And why do they do that? Because games are designed to be sticky. Go tonight and you're going to see how designers think about and talk about and user test their game. They think in terms of, it's so different because I'm a professor and I work with teachers. And so I'm not used to thinking about what is the first 2 minutes of the experience? What is the first 20 minutes of the experience? Where does it get too hard that I need to smooth out the learning curve? How do I keep them connected in 2 hours, right? That's not how we think about it in education typically. Typically how I think about it, and I will say this even though I'm teaching an online course now, is something like, suck it up, right? I mean, you're in my course. It's hard. Go do it because you have to. Game designers don't think that way. They think about how do you create an experience that is complicated and challenging, but also keeps the player there. And that's significant and cool. 4, data exhaust. There is a huge booming industry right now that's emerging around games and assessment because the kinds of data exhaust you can get off games allow you to do forms of assessment that are really exciting. You can do formative assessment that doesn't have to be summative. You can look at how players solve problems, how their choices predict whether or not they'll succeed later on, right? How they choose their problems. You can even do really cool stuff. One of my doctoral students did her dissertation. I'm so proud of this. She, rather than mining all the success data from a game we made about stem cells, it was a hard game. It was a zombie game, because if you're going to do a stem cell game, it ought to be about the zombie apocalypse, obviously. So she looked at all the data exhausts, but she chose to mine all the failures and not all the successes. And what she found is that there are very different forms of failure. And those forms of failure do predict later success. So all that data that we used to treat like noise, that we still treat like noise in a paper sort of exam, we say these are the ones you got wrong. It turns out there's a ton of data in there that tell you something about what a kid or an adult understands. So the forms of data exhaust you can get out of the back end of games is pretty exciting. And because of that data, you can do things like continuous improvement through A/B testing. You can't do that with a textbook. And you can personalize, which I know this community already knows lots about that. 5, as I said before, that allows for scalable formative assessment. And given what's happening right now in K through 12, which is an area that I happen to care about, this is super important because our forms of assessment are out of control, right? They are out of control. So thinking about a way in which we could get back to testing what matters, testing what we care about, which is things like activity and understanding rather than summative tests, right? And games offer that potential. All right, so that's enough about the affordances of games for doing good in the world. Let me talk a little bit about my own research. So in my career, I met Andy and Liz and others here. I don't even want to say how many years ago that was. I was just finishing my dissertation. I'm trained in cognitive science applied to education, which means that I'm trained to do sort of lab experiments, right? And in the 11th hour, right around prelims, I met a guy named Jim G. I had been in his reading group, and Jim G. was just in the middle of writing a book called What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Literacy and Learning. And I started reading some of his early manuscripts, got very excited because at that time I was building like chat rooms and looking at what are the differences as an intervention between having, for example, two people discuss a controversial issue versus read about a controversial issue, right? And testing to see sort of how is that different. And I got really excited about his work on games because, I was doing these experiments where I had to basically pay or cajole and bribe participants to participate in my study, right? So, and we ran these comparative studies. This was sort of my master's in preliminary work. But when you looked at the transcripts, it was very clear no one wanted to be there. And if you've ever been in a discussion in a chat room where no one wants to be there, it turns out it's not a great intervention. So even when we could find significant results, if you look at the transcripts, it's clear this isn't the kind of intervention I would want to be advocating. So when I first logged into a game, what I saw were people that were paying money to do forms of problem solving that were far beyond the complexity of what I would possibly assign in our labs. And the media allowed for this joint activity, right? And I'm a sociocultural theorist, so the idea of people doing activity together, see, I believe people learn from each other and technology enables it or it gets in the way. So to me, things like games were super exciting because technology was enabling this sort of joint apprenticeship, this joint activity that was very exciting to me. So I moved everything to games. And at the time I did that, there really wasn't a lot of work from sort of a cognitive science angle. And when I say not a lot, there was nothing on games. There was nothing on games in cognitive science. So I stepped back and started reading a lot of like the TV studies with child development, etc. But what I needed to do was rather than do a bunch of lab experiments treating the game as an intervention, which is already a whole ball of wax, I stepped back and decided I needed to do a large-scale ethnography to figure out what would even be the right research questions, right? So I did this 2.5-year ethnography. Are there any students in here? Students. Okay, so if your advisor ever recommends or approves you doing a 2.5-year ethnography, I want you to say no. Just no. Not a dissertation should not take 2.5 years to gather the data. But that was that. And then with the help of MacArthur Foundation and funders, I managed, after I finished my dissertation and had a faculty job, to do a bunch of follow-up studies on those variables that I identified in the first ethnography as really important to game culture. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of this so I can get to some core issues around why I think games are more important generally. All right, so I'm going to use literacy practices as one of them. So in the ethnography that we did, at this time there was a large scale, and this comes up about every 6-7 years. There was this sort of large scale American fear that games were replacing books. So you had titles of things like A is for Ox, right? The rise of electronic media and the fall of literacy. And there was a lot of sort of trepidation that kids were playing games and not reading. So, and it turns out that's actually not true. Violence is not on the rise, but apparently facts don't get in the way of a good book title, which we're still learning today. But I wanted to do some work that would actually look at, okay, so if we're going to take that claim seriously, right, when people are afraid of something like that, there's usually a reason. People are not crazy. There's a reason that they're concerned. So I wanted to make sure I looked at, okay, if that's the case, then what are the actual literacy practices involved in games? Right? And by this I mean not the fancy multimodal literacy. I'm talking straight up print text, old school conservative reading, decoding print text, and encoding print text. And of course it turns out that games require and recruit a ton of literacy to get them going. See, I spent a lot of time studying online multiplayer games, massively multiplayer games. At that time, those were some of the most popular out, like Lineage 2, global market. Now it's World of Warcraft. So I wanted to see how much reading and writing is entailed in that, and it turns out a lot. Not only in the game and between players and among players, but also in terms of the fan community that's required reading and writing in order to do well at the game. So we ended up finding from this ethnography that, yes, games are this constellation of literacy practices. So it turns out it's really hard to make the claim that games are replacing reading and writing when games require reading and writing, right? All right. Let me give you a little example of one of them, fan fiction. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with fan fiction. I am not a fan fiction scholar, though I can point to some amazing ones. And at the time, my office mate, Rebecca Black, who's now at UC Irvine, she was doing her work on ESL students teaching one another English using manga fan sites. Amazing stuff. So I was like, well, let me look at what's happening in this space. So I went and looked. I'm going to give you an example of what fan fiction in the game space looks like. So, little backstory. This is in the ethnography. So, Orient Knight is a high schooler in New York State. I'm in New York State. He was also one of my informants in the ethnography, which meant that he played with his father, and both he and his father would periodically take phone calls with me, and we'd talk about, like, meaning in the game and what are they doing and why do they do that, and I would send them documents and they would send them back and tell me how boring I was, etc., etc. So Orient Knight was also a very well-known writer, and this is Lineage 1 at the time, which is a Korean player versus player game. Now, by being a popular fan fiction writer, what I mean to say is that Orient Knight would write frequent stories that had chapters that he would release every couple weeks, and they were good enough to be posted to the corporate site, right? So the corporation NCSoft is posting them on their sort of corporate site stuff, right? Now, there was this thing in Lineage where, in Lineage and most online games, you form guilds or clans or groups, which are sort of your social little community, right? And in this game, you compete with each other in very violent and amazing ways, which is super fun. Like, you siege castles. You don't just say mean things. It's super great. So Orient Knight was a great fan fiction writer. And in this community, if you could get the stories from the top writers early, it was sort of a sign of social capital. So I was working in a guild, right? I was a siege princess running a guild for 3.5 years. Don't ask. And if you could get, what you would do is, if you were on the inside cool circle, you would get an early release of the story and you'd put it up on your site, which would increase all the traffic to your site, right? That was the cool thing to do. So Orient Knight was one of those writers. Now he's also happened to be one of my informants, which was good for me. He is 17 at the time of writing this, Depardieu, so it's Blinding Twilight's the name of it, and Depardieu is the name of our server, which is important for games like this, and he goes on to write, "A dawn eclipsed the town of Aden, it seemed its light would never reach the end of the grand city, built under the tyrannical rule of Ken Raoul and the corrupt mage Serenus, blah, 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 blah." This is all based on the pseudo-medieval theme of the game, right? And I can tell you a lot about stuff like, it's written at grade level, which actually is exceptional for boys in high school. It actually is using genre conventions. It has all this great literacy feature. But I'm going to spare you those details and go straight to why I love it. When he sends it to me, look at the cover email of what he has to say. "Man, you guys have come so far. Too bad I didn't go back with y'all guys to a different server. Anyways, good luck on your journey through Lineage, and I'm glad you never quit. I included a news story if you'd like to read or post up. It's awesome, raised eyebrows, even though I used it just to hit on this girl." Right. For Cushy, right? So my point being that I'll get into the literacy stuff later about why it's good stuff, but it's a world in which writing a story as a high school boy in New York State is considered a way to hit on a girl. Now, I'm not young per se, but where I grew up and the high schools I work in, most high school cultures do not necessarily use fiction writing and literacy as a form of hitting on one another. So this is exciting to me, right? But if you ask players in the game, if you ask them, "Do you like to read and write?" This is the kind of interaction you have. So here's another piece of data from the ethnography. Sharp Paw is a 7th grader. Now, this is I have to tell you the story because he's one of my favorite informants of all time. So Sharpaw is a 7th grader. This interaction, this data point comes from the beginning of summer. And what had happened was that he was in our guild. Around Christmas, his grades came back and he was not doing well. So his mother pulled the internet cord and said, you will not be gaming until you get your grades up. So he worked really hard, got his grades up. At the end of spring, grades were up. Mom said, great, you can game again. It's the beginning of summer. He's super excited to be back on the game, okay? 7th grader, all right. Oh yeah, to celebrate me coming back to the pledge and being ranked, which is he was given his rank in the military order back, I decided to write another story for the site. And I say, oh my gosh, do it. We need more stories, right? You can see me, la, do it. And he says, of course. In fact, I've planned it. I got the perfect story idea the other day when, and then he tells me the origin story, and I'm going to spare you all that long blah, 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 about the origin story of this piece. It's called An Old Knight's Tale. You'll see it within the next 2 to 3 months. Okay, this is the beginning of summer. So I don't know if you have 7th graders in your home or if you have them in your ecosystem whatsoever. But I do. Well, not a 7th grader, but I have 2 boys in my house. And starting a writing project that's going to last 2 to 3 months at the beginning of summer, this is right. Wow, do you like to write in your spare time? No, I like to play this in my spare time. So what's going on here is that if you ask kids, do you like to write? Do you like to read? They're like, no. I like to play the game. It just so happens that the game requires this constellation of literacy practices, right? And if you try to tag them as something that's school-based, there's a lot of resistance to that, right? I've studied science, math, reading, problem solving, collaborative work, time and time and time again. When I talk to kids and I say, do you realize what you're doing is science? They're like, oh, heck no. What we're trying to do is cheat the game. Now, on a one level, as an academic and sort of a person who was very school-oriented, that's how we all got here. We were all the school-oriented folks, pretty much. From that point of view, I find it concerning a little bit that calling it science or calling it literacy or literature turns kids off, right? Because to me, those are really exciting fields. But on the other hand, what does it mean when they're doing all of these forms of intellectual work in their private times and considering it just a part of their gameplay? This is sort of the world we wanted to have happen. And it does happen with games. I think part of what's missing is the connection of how it connects back to their schoolwork or to other things in their life, which I'll get to. All right. So, in sum, these literacy practices are a natural part of everyday gameplay. They're interest-driven. But what is the nature and quality of the text? So after we did this big ethnography, with the help of MacArthur Foundation and some other funding, decided to go back and start doing some more sort of systematic empirical studies on the variables that we found that were most interesting. Great. So one of them was literacy. And it's great to say that text is a natural part of gameplay, that it's high status. Okay, but is it good? And what kind of text are we talking about? So that's what we investigated. We did a study where we did exhaustive interviews with both experts and novices to find out what kind of text they were using. Now we're working on World of Warcraft because my work, I tend to follow the game that's most popular, not the game that's most complex, right? So at this time, it just shifted. It went from Lineage 1, Lineage 2, and now I'm in World of Warcraft because World of Warcraft basically is the market for online games now. Can I say that? Yeah, it's like 62% of the market still. And this is 10 years ago when it launched, 12 years ago when it launched. Okay, so ask them what they use, and it turns out that 45% of the information that they are actually reading and writing is informational. It's expository. And this matters because expository text is also the hardest text to teach kids in school. Narrative is easier, expository is much harder. If you look at the reading level of those texts, so we pulled a random sample and did analyses of reading level, you find that the average reading level is 12th grade. That places it, by the way, this 12th grade reading level places it, for example, higher than Newsweek, right? Most, but not higher than Sports Illustrated. True. There's that. Most newspapers, most good journalism is written at about an 8th grade level because you want readability. So this is 12th grade level. If you look at its lexical analysis, just meaning analyzing the kinds of vocabulary words that are in it, what you find is that 4% of it is academic words from the academic word list. Now here's a little trick, especially if there are any of you who have kids in your home. that are currently studying for some standardized tests. So standardized tests, a really strong predictor of your performance is your academic vocabulary. So if you want to increase things like on standardized, SAT, ACT, GRE, one place to drill down is your vocabulary. And there's something called the academic word list, and that list is all of the academic words that appear in textbooks regardless of the domain. So they appear in textbooks across history, science, English, whatever, right? This AWL word list is considered sort of the Bible, that if you really want to kill someone on literacy and get their test score up, but probably make them never want to read again, one thing to do is drill them hard on this list, right? So 4% is actually from the AWL word list, which is really interesting because if you were to create an intervention that would improve students' vocabulary understanding, their range of words they understand, it would be right around 4 to 5%. The reason is that a text, you don't want too many words that you don't know in a text, or you can't use the context of the text to understand it. This comes up again later, right? So to read at independent or instructional level, it needs to be about 4 to 6%. So what I'm pointing out here is that not only are they 12th grade reading texts, and not only are they expository, but they have academic words embedded in them. This is like a perfect storm of a literacy intervention. So while America is decrying how games are replacing reading, if you look at what gamers are actually doing in the most popular titles, it turns out to look a lot like a literacy intervention. Okay, so there's the sum of it. Looks pretty great. But then here's this question. Why aren't boys doing better at school? Because the game I was studying throughout this period, these three, are all still predominantly played by boys. World of Warcraft, I think the last stat, when I was pulling these data, it was about 18% female audience, right? So predominantly boys. And yet, here I am showing, think about this, here I am showing that games with a predominantly male audience are recruiting all of this literacy work, right? Interest-driven literacy work that includes all this wonderful stuff, and yet you don't see anything paying off in schools. Well, think about it. Games are this contemporary equivalent of traditional boy play spaces. That's Henry Jenkins' work. And yet only 65% of boys graduate high school. They underperform and opt out of literacy-related coursework. They score consistently lower on the NAEP. Boys, on average, read 2 grades below level. In fact, when I submitted, I'm going to go through a lab study that we did to look at what's happening between school and games for males in particular. When I submitted that manuscript in the intro, I said, we have a national crisis because boys read 2 grades below average. The editor wrote me back and said, I think it's hyperbole that you call it a crisis. This has been going on for 2 or 3 decades. And I was like, Well, as a mother of 2 boys, I think that qualifies as a mega crisis. That's not hyperbole, that's deep concern. All right, so in order to get at this question, why would all this literacy stuff be happening in games, and how is it related to school or not? Let me check my time here. We created this after-school program for boys. So what we needed to be able to do is look at what happens when you take a group of males, you put them on games, you look to see what literacy practices they're engaging in, and you also get to study what's happening in their school lives, right? It's one thing to study sort of text around a game. It's another thing to study people doing stuff over time. So that's what we were going for. By the way, when we basically formed this casual guild, and we studied these boys for a year. This is what we looked like online. When I set up this study, I did not even have to put out recruitment ads. Rumors got out that I was creating some work that was around boys and games and academic work, and parents literally showed up at my door before we even started recruiting. It is incredible, the number of families out there for whom this is a huge area of interest and concerns, because they watch their sons who do amazing work in the game and basically don't engage in school, right? So when we put this study together, we pulled 25 kids. It's the most we could handle. We met on campus once a month. We gamed together frequently, 3, 4, 5 times a week. And we weren't really sure sort of what demographic variables might matter. So what we went for was maximum variation, meaning out of all of the parents who tried to hand us their sons, we chose about half to be urban and half to be rural, right? About half to be high, like middle and higher SES, and about half to be working class, because we weren't sure what variables mattered. So if you don't know, you try to spread your distribution. Make sense? There was only one rule that everyone had to have in common, and that was that you were good at games, you loved games, and you hated school. That was the recruitment criteria, and it turns out not to be a strict one, right? But as I'll show you, about half the kids in the group, as we selected them, half were chosen because they were doing okay in school. They were reading at level. And the other half were considered struggling readers, 2 or more grades below. Okay, so that's going to matter in a minute. So then we looked at, how did they do over time? How does this all relate? So let me show you a little bit of the study. So here's the literacy practices. And we can show that 12th grade reading level, these are high school boys. I had one middle school boy because it was the little brother of a kid whose mom needed both of them taken, and I was like, send them to me. So majority high school kids. I remember I said it was a 12th grade reading level with academic vocabulary, and about half of them were struggling readers. So think about that. They're high school kids. They should not be able to read this text. And yet every single one of them read the text that we were reading for the game with perfect comprehension. And I know that because I watched them draw inferences from the text and use them in their games. We studied them really closely. So what's going on when I give them a 12th grade and higher text around the game, and kids who are marked, half of them are struggling readers, and yet they are all performing just the same. They're all doing great. That's the question we started with. So why? Well, we decided we should look at a study of this. So what we wanted to ask was, how is reading game-related text related to school-related text? And here's what we did. We set up a study in which we would, number one, give them the QRI so we knew their reading level at the very start, right? So we gave them a reading assessment right now so I knew just what they were diagnosed as reading at. And then we gave them 2 different texts to read. One of them was game text that was pulled straight from the authentic real game resources. The second one, we literally pulled out of their textbooks. We literally went to schools, found their textbooks, pulled text out. And then we did some pre-stuff and some post-stuff to look at things like comprehension, attitude, whatever. We counterbalanced to make sure we weren't, stacking the deck by putting reading second when all the kids were tired. Does that make sense? Okay, so they did 2 readings, and we looked at all of the sort of performances they did while reading. Now, when we set up this study, we also decided that we would, in order to make it at the right reading level for them, we went and found text that was at the reading level they were diagnosed at. Does that make sense? So if you're diagnosed at reading at the 8th grade level, we went and found 8th grade text around the game, 8th grade text in your classroom, and looked and said, show me your reading. Okay, so that's the study that we did. Here's the materials. That's what a game text looks like. That's what a school text looks like. That was a treatment. And here's what we found. When you compare reading around school text and reading around game text, when you control difficulty to be at their level, so all of them, as I said, at or below level, what you find is that there's no significant difference. There were no differences that we could find across their performance in school and their performance on games. But what gives? Because we saw that they were, in fact, reading text they shouldn't have been able to read. So we thought, well, what are we missing here? And then it dawned on us, well, here's the thing. We didn't let them choose the topic. We chose it because we chose the text, right? And we also artificially deflated difficulty in order to make it the right reading level for what they were diagnosed in the QRI as. Get it? So we thought, let's redo this a little bit. Let's redo it. So we redid the study. We did one more thing. We said, come back in and we're going to do one more reading. And this time you tell us 3 topics that you want to read more about in order to improve your gameplay, to figure something out in the game. They told us topics, and then we scrambled out and found text on one of those topics that was at least 12th grade, at least 2 grades above their head, right? So we found text that was difficult, that was on their area of interest, but should have been hard for them to read. And here's what happens. So when participants choose topic, what you find, and this is just showing you that the average reading level for our text at this point is freshman college. The difference, it's 4.5 grades on average above their head. Okay, when you do this, what you find is that students are reading up to 8 grades above their diagnosed reading level. Up to 8 grades above their, what? It gets even better. If you disaggregate the data and look at struggling and non-struggling readers, what you find is no significant differences. So let me put this very bluntly. When kids read texts they are interested in understanding, all those differences between struggling and non-struggling readers go away. Right? They go away. Now you should be, lighting things on fire, standing up and saying, this is not possible, right? Because if you know anything about assessment, this should not be possible. And yet it happens. So you find that when kids care about the text, they actually read above what their diagnosis is. So why? Well, we went back to their performances. And what you find on the first study, remember I did school versus games, but I picked it. If you look at their reading of a game text that I picked, you find a self-correction rate about 17%. Now, bear with me for a minute. I know it's been a long sitting period, but bear with me. So self-correction, when you are a reader, self-correcting your problems, all readers encounter challenges when they read or they're reading too low level of text, right? But we all encounter like a word we don't understand or something like that. And what a strong reader does is they hit that challenge and they figure out, they sort of bootstrap themselves using context to understand the word, right? So self-correction rates are not considered an error. They're what a good reader does. It means that you hit a challenge, which most readers do, right? If you're reading something of substance, that's you hit a challenge, you fix the challenge, you move on. Okay, so in the first text that's game-related that I chose for them, their self-correction rate is 17%. There's not a lot exciting there. But when you actually instead say a game text that they get to choose, it more than doubles. This is significant to like .p.01. So what you're finding is persistence in the face of challenges. What you're seeing is that kids, especially struggling readers, or including, I should say, struggling readers, when they care about understanding a text, it turns out that even though they're still hitting just as many challenges in the text, but they care enough to figure out what the word means, what the clause structure is saying, because they care about understanding the content of the text. Or, this is one of our Mark, it's a pseudonym. This is a gem. We did these preliminary things, these interviews about reading. And we asked, do you like reading? We asked this stupid question. And his response was like, I don't know. No. I mean, it depends on what I'm reading, right? It depends on what you're reading. If you're actually interested, performance is different. And you have to ask yourselves, people, what kind of assessment conflates what you're interested in with what you're able to do? All right? Assessments have a long history in the States. Think Mismeasure of Man, Stephen Jay Gould, they have a long history in the States of conflating culture with ability. And what you're seeing here is that we are that QRI, which is a solid reading assessment, But what does it mean when we're conflating interest and ability in this way? And I'll promise you something else. It only bites certain members of the population and not others. It is not equitable in terms of who gets labeled as struggling based on reading a text that they're not interested in. Okay, but let me talk about interest, not games interest, because this is the realization that we had in our labs, was that games are amazing, but what games really are these vehicles for interest-driven learning. And that's a really, in some ways, it's sort of coming around full circle, right? Because I told you about why I got involved in games was because no one wanted to be there in the interventions that we were actually creating. So the one place to study games is that people seem to want to be there, and it turns out that seeming to want to be there actually generates things like persistence in the face of challenges, which lead to huge differences in terms of learning and assessments. But that's not the only place you see interest mattering. Let me say a few words about pop up a level, right? So when I told you about this data story, it's a story about how games play into the ecosystem of media, print media in kids' lives. But I want to talk about how games play into the ecosystems of higher education, because this is really interesting to me as well. Interesting. So we formed a group called the Higher Education Video Game Alliance. This sort of came out of work I was doing in DC 3 years ago. This is an alliance across programs that do game design, just like our IT and Magic Center. And there are now 406 programs in higher ed. But I want to get to a stat here. By the way, these alums, they have a really terrific hire rate. I'm going to skip all that and get to one point. It turns out, though, check out these figures, that when you add games to, let me back up and say, so if you compare things like games to their adjacency fields, like usually games are in, say, computer science. If you compare games to other STEM-based fields, computer engineering, computer science, etc., some interesting things start to happen. So here what you're seeing is that our freshman to sophomore retention rate for game-based programs is 88%. That's actually terrific. Look at where public and private schools are. Right, that's a really great retention rate. But now look over here on percentage of women enrolled. In video game programs, we have 30% undergraduates are women. It's not parity, but it's double the number who are going into code-based fields outside of games, right? So what's my point? Well, my point is that games are this really disruptive medium. They don't replace reading. They don't replace print or any of those other activities. What they do is they sort of reconfigure them into worlds in which reading and science and code are toward a creative activity, toward beating the game, right? They give a motivation and an interest. They sort of reconfigure how it is that something like reading and writing is done in kids' lives. But they also, when they're on college campuses, start to reshape what our programs look like. Because I don't know if you're aware, but in computer science and code, we're not only are there a few women, 17% undergraduate, but it's slightly going down over time, which is a huge problem. And you put something like games in, and suddenly you see that number double. And I think we can even raise it there. So I find the role of games in these broader ecosystems really important. As I said, games are these architectures for engagement. That's the point I want to return to. And that's what's so important here is actually the notion of engagement and interest as being the focal point in the reorganization of intellectual work as we know it and media work as we know it. This is the wrong frame, right? I'm not even going to say the words aloud because I hate this metaphor so much. I'm just going to not say the words aloud. But it is the wrong frame to think that interest is some sort of candy coating that you put on top of something after it's fully baked. That is not what interest is, right? Interest is the driving coherence in a domain. That's what interest is. And engaging kids' interest is not, is not catering to them, is not spoiling them. It's actually making their intellectual work meaningful. And it's what we ought to be doing as designers, right, as teachers. I also want to say that this, too, is the wrong frame. So here's a shot of, I love some history stuff around media and classrooms. So this is the American Television Network, I think it was called. Ford Foundation poured a lot of money into building what TV was now big, TV. And they had this great idea that they would create this democratizing force of television in classrooms, okay? And they would create this network where students in rural areas like where I grew up got to have great content by having great teachers on television come into classrooms. But I want you to look to see what they did, right? Oh, do you see what's on this television? Okay, this is a classroom of students sitting in rows watching a classroom sitting in rows. Wow, right? What we did, we took what we already did in schools and we put it on media. Done. That's the wrong model too. So if I'm saying that, this is the wrong model, so is this one. We can't simply take games and do what we've always done with them. If we're doing that, we're not doing it right, and we're going to end up where we were with the network of television, which, by the way, eventually evolved toward PBS, so kudos to that incarnation, but it had to be reincarnated as something different. So I will end there, except for one quote by Maria Montessori, and that is, why does this matter? Because these are not new ideas. These are not new ideas at all. Maria Montessori said, education is a natural process carried out by a child and not acquired by listening to words, but by experiences. And the one thing I want you to remember, which many of you already know through interactive media, is that video games turn screen time into activity time. They give people firsthand experiences. And that is part of the power, and they're enduring. This is why we talk about them being overly sticky and addictive and all these things, because people are having transformative and interesting experiences on them. So what might happen if we use them as a way to re-engage in all the other activities that get drawn up into them? I think it's transformative. If you like these topics, we do have a conference later in August, but I will end there. Thank you.
We have just a couple of minutes for questions. So we started a little late. If there's anyone out there who'd like to ask a question, just shout it out. Howard, talk loud.
In your study, did you find out how many kids were dyslexic?
No, and what a great question. I have one graduate student who's looking at dyslexia, but broader to disabilities and games. But this is a really important topic. I don't have data on it from my lab, but I will tell you that anecdotally, there's a strong relationship between gaming and children who are on the spectrum. There is something happening there that it is consistent, and it's sort of something we talk about informally, but I don't know anyone who's actually done the data analysis on it.
I don't think my experience is in art schools, and I've been there all my life, and I've taught there for 40 years. I would say 50% of my students are dyslexic, and 50% of my faculty.
Wow. Yeah, isn't it interesting? We need someone who's going to study this phenomenon. I will say that for a designer practitioner, Peggy Sheehy is one huge force for learning who's using games as a way to engage students with disabilities at younger ages. It's a great question, though.
One more, quickly. Right there.
Hi. Are you continuing to conduct your research looking at poverty indexes with regard to academic performance? In our research, we found that students were able to perform in-game at very high levels, but when we gave them traditional pre-post inventories, they really struggled with specialist language, so we experimented with introducing them in the games.
Wow.
And we're able to produce really great pre-post outcomes afterwards, and we we're continuing that research.
Yes, I will tell you that inequity around poverty, if we're not all in education working on that issue, then we're not doing our jobs. I'm going to be blunt. And there's more to say on that, and I'm just going to spare you my rant on that one. On the issue of specialized language outside the game and specialized language inside of it, this is actually really important. The meta-analyses around games show that, and they show lots of great things, like, 22% higher increase than traditional methods, blah, blah, blah. But you see when you disaggregate based on topic that language learning is there's a much bigger effect size for games and language learning than all the other domains. And it's interesting because Jim G's work predicted that. He basically said, here's the theoretical reason why, and it's because you're learning language in a situated, embodied way, right? You're learning a new term in the context of its use, where it's applicable, and that's how humans learn language, right? So that was a theoretical argument he made back in 2004, and now what we're seeing is if you look at studies of games and impact across different disciplines, games for language learning is a big impact, not just when you're using language, when you're using games, for example, to teach English as a second language or games to teach a foreign language, but including when you're using games to teach science and you get the language development for free, which is amazing, really, right? So that pattern that you're seeing, you're on exactly the right pattern. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much.